So
Hi.
we've got Noah with us this morning here, and I'm Nina, and I'm joining from London. And Noah is from Rescaled and is joining us from Brussels this morning. So I'd love to welcome you, Noah, to our Future is Human conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me as well.
And we're going to start with a very kind of human question to start with, which is, yeah, how are you today? We've just had the weekend. How are you coming to this conversation this morning on this Monday morning?
Yeah, what a lovely question. I've actually had a really good start to the working day today. The sun is also starting to shine again a lot more. I'm feeling sort of that, feeling of spring oncoming and sort of hope and having a bit more motivation to go after the things that, at a personal level, but also within work and like feeling inspired through that as well. And I just had actually already a few good conversations this morning, so I was really glad to start the week this way and talked about hope a bit this morning and things like that. So it's actually a nice feeling coming into this call.
I love that. Yeah, we had a conversation in our first workshop about the tulips sort of blossoming and all those sort of spring flowers sort of coming out. And I'm looking
Hmm.
forward to, yeah, sort of seeing the tulips in Amsterdam I'm going to next week. So yeah, I think it's just that sense of new beginnings and yeah,
Yes.
hopeful starts as well. And you're organizing an event as well, aren't you, at the moment? So how's that
Right. Yeah,
going?
yeah. So it is a very busy time as well. And also we're doing things in a different way, a new format, we're organizing it in Albania. That's a new way of collaboration for us. So that's really exciting as well.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we'll get into that a bit more later in the
Yeah.
interview, definitely. So, can you tell us a bit about yourself as a human and when you feel most alive? What aspect of you is the most human? You talked about personal and professional earlier. So, yeah, what makes you human? What makes you feel alive?
Sure. I think it's a bit of a tricky question, sort of, who are you as a human? It's a broad question, but I think a few things that come to mind at first is that I've always been a very curious person, very passionate about learning, even about things and topics and people that aren't so close to me, or it's not something that I want to do something with it in the future. Just the act of learning and being open to new information has always been driving me a lot, and as such I've always been interested in a broad range of things, which sometimes has been confusing because you feel like you might be searching for a direction or where you want to go, what type of job you want to have. Even when I decided what to study, which I ended up doing criminology, but even that was sort of this tough choice. Is like, oh, all these things are so interesting. The act of learning is something that I'm very passionate about, and I think to me it's also a key component of who I am, and I think how we can be as a collective, as humans together, whether that's a formal way of learning or learning through a conversation with someone or through someone sharing something with you, whether that's also in a different medium like a movie or a book, or a story. I think that's a key part, I think, of humanness in a sense. And I think the moment I feel most alive is when I'm not time constrained. So having the opportunity to be very in present in a moment, whether that's alone, whether that's with other people, whether that's in nature, having that opportunity to just engage in the moment itself and let the moment and the connection with whoever you're with or yourself sort of guide where you're going next. I think it's an incredibly unique and special feeling. And I think some of us are more privileged than others in how often you can experience that, but also, of course, maybe where you grew up, how the culture is, and how society is organized. But to me, that's the moment I feel most alive because it feels like there's endless opportunities, and there's a lot of presence, whether that can be positive things or even confrontational. Just that idea of having an opportunity to choose on what happens next, or yeah, experience something else. I think that's a feeling that makes me feel very alive. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was interesting. In our first workshop, we had someone from the Prison Phoenix Trust who they do yoga in prisons talking about that
Hmm.
exact concept of that being present and being aware. I think there's so many distractions as well nowadays that,
Yeah,
having those moments of being really present is quite rare sometimes as well.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, And I definitely resonate with you about having lots of different interests and things. And I think that, you and I have both worked in alliances and networks. And I think it's,
Yes.
when you've got lots of interests and you like broad, sort of breadth of knowledge and different, sort of disciplines and things, working in those kind of networks and alliances spaces
It's
suits,
the best. Yeah.
our
Yeah.
personality types well, I
Yeah,
think.
definitely.
Excellent. We'll talk a bit about that now. So yeah, if you could tell us a bit about your organization, about Rescaled, what it is that you do, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So I do work at Rescaled, so the European Movement for Detention Houses. What it is a European NGO. So we have a couple of members now in 20 European countries. So those are either individuals or organizations who are active in justice reform or somehow connected to justice in a way that also includes academics, that includes experienced experts, that includes managing bodies of a detention facility, for example, and also NGOs providing services to formerly or currently incarcerated people, for example. And Rescaled supports the idea of actually replacing large prison institutions with detention houses, which are essentially detention facilities that are small scale, quite small, so maximum of 30 people, and that differentiate according to the individual. So really individually tailored support, but when it comes to education, the time spent in detention, but also the way freedom and autonomy and so forth is organized for that person. And the idea is also that they're integrated in the community. So that's geographically when it comes to location, but really also in terms of the collaboration with local services, even just adding value to the community or the community even coming in as volunteers, just establishing really a relationship with the local community. So that's the idea of what we do. And we do that through various ways. So we do mostly a lot of lobby and advocacy, of course, when it comes to that. And a lot of that is also bringing people together. So that's been a really big part of Rescaled and how it's grown as an organization, and the broader movement around that in the last 5-6 years has really been bringing people together in a room from different backgrounds and seeing there is this shared vision to drive systemic change and to adapt the place also of how we execute deprivation of liberty, and seeing what does that look like, what do we need, what type of knowledge or evidence are we missing, what could we potentially co-produce, and also what narrative are we building and pushing with that. And my role within that specifically is that I work within the European office of Rescaled. So we're a small team, 4 people, or 4 to 5, who work on coordinating that movement from a European level. So a lot of it is that bringing people together, but also seeing, our members in the various countries are doing incredible work, and seeing that we can also utilize that and find synergies and see what the work that they have done or success that they have achieved or knowledge that they have can potentially be translated to another context and potentially be applied there to sort of ensure that we can help each other evolve and learn and grow towards that mission of implementing detention houses further in Europe. And so that's part of our work and my work as well, specifically in seeing how that goes along. And just, yeah, I would say, there's so many change makers involved. And I feel like part of my role is just being I'm a little pin in that. Yeah.
Yeah, coordinating that, drawing all that together, that's such a huge, that sort of web of, or sort
Yeah.
of broader sort of ecosystem that you've got around you. And I love what you were saying, about autonomy and choice. And I think that links to that first question about, sort of being human, this idea of being able to make choices, be able to have that more, autonomy, which obviously in larger scale facilities is, is a lot less. Is that something that's particularly important to you?
Definitely. I think a lot of our work is and was at the start and still is today is reflecting on the work that we're doing and the terms that we're using and what we're proposing and what we're advocating for. And it's also deconstructing a lot of the reference frames and frameworks and ideas and definitions that we know of our current prison systems that have been constructed even based on really progressive and values and ambitions, and still somehow through the institutionalization in the way that it's been sort of set up, and essentially it hasn't changed that much in 200 years. There's a lot of deconstruction that needs to happen if when we use a term like security or safety, what does that mean to someone? And if we base that off of what we currently have, which is oftentimes, for example, low, medium, high security, or an open and a closed regime and a half open regime. And in that country, it works like this. If it's hard to deconstruct that narrative, it's also hard to imagine how we can do it differently. And so a lot really comes into, do we create security through even, what a building looks like, or how many doors there are and how many alarm systems there are, what type of technology or the way someone walks, that could be a part of it, but a big part. And I think according to myself and according to a lot of people within Rescaled and who we've worked with, it's really the majority of security is that's done through people and that's done through care. And I think a lot of people resonate with that, but still translating that to practice is really difficult. So really seeing what does that mean, and we've experienced a lot of systems that are very risk-based. There's so many risk assessment models, and there's oftentimes this perspective of the system that is being put on an individual, and deconstructing that and saying, okay, especially, you're doing all this work on humanists, seeing that person as a human, and not as a flight risk, for example, because that's a perspective really from the system. So, this is this person, that's the what are their needs? What do they need to be reminded of? And I think it's a lot of work still to be done. And it's a lot of work that a lot of people are doing. And I think it's very exciting because it also feels like, again, we're constantly learning through these conversations and sort of deconstructing these various and reconstructing also that idea together and collectively, which I think is a really important part. And also explaining and finding out from practice and from, for example, lived experience, what that feels like. Because it might seem that moving away from that means being quote unquote soft on crime, or that is not so tough, and really learning that that's actually very confrontational. And it's really, really difficult to do it that way. And oftentimes it demands more of a person, and it demands more of staff, and knowing what that looks like, and being aware of, how we can collectively, how do you help facilitate that change? So that's definitely a really big part of it. And I think one of the biggest differences between large prison institutions and detention houses is that you're not so much stuck in this old framework that then you're trying to apply new values and new policies and new ambitions to, but trying to also adapt the environment so that we're able to really do what essentially everybody's already trying to do within our current prison institutions. There's so many good people working in there who want to apply that, but it's just very hard if your system and your environment doesn't really allow for that for 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said there about, that sort of deconstruction and then reconstruction, but doing that as a collective. Comes back to your point about being curious and learning and hearing lots of different perspectives, and getting all those perspectives in the room, and allowing the space and the time to have those really important conversations, which doesn't always feel like work, but it is the work.
Exactly.
It's absolutely foundational by the sounds of it as well to what you're doing. And I love what you said about as well around sort of what it feels like. We did an imagination activity in the first workshop, and one of the groups really kind of lent into what it would feel like to be in that new future, that new sort of human justice system. And it was really powerful, just drawing on that sort of what does it actually feel like, as opposed to necessarily, it's important to think about what does it look like, and what does it, all those senses, but also what it feels like as well. So
I can imagine for a lot of the people taking part in, or who took part in your first workshop and the next ones as well, and fellow advocates and organizations, it also isn't easy to, for example, also keep funding the work that we're doing, and justice reform, and it's usually not something that's super attractive. And even with a lot of people are doing EU funded projects and all these things, and as you mentioned, having these conversations doesn't feel like work. It's something that you need to translate into something, into an activity. and it doesn't feel like maybe there's a lot of progress, but this is actually really the foundation. That's sort of the invisible part of the work that you're doing. And sometimes it's also tricky to showcase that work that you're doing it, and finding support to keep doing that work as well. So I think that's an added challenge to see of how can we make that seem relevant for all the involved stakeholders as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're dealing with something as complex and the sort of the such a diversity within that ecosystem, those sort of conversations, those narratives, that deconstructing, reconstructing work, like you said, is absolutely foundational.
Yeah.
I wanted to, we invited you to bring along an object which represents a moment of humanness within your work. Just wanted to ask you, invite you to sort of share your object and share the significance of it with our
Yes.
listeners.
It actually ties really well into what we've just discussed, luckily. So I brought a coffee cup. This is an espresso cup. I personally, I love to like collect little ceramics here and there whenever I travel, or now my friends have caught on to that, so they gift it to me when they're somewhere. They buy a little cup, so I have this sort of random collection of coffee cups. The reason I was thinking about it was what we've just talked about. Something I experience a lot in my day-to-day work as well is the diverse range of people that I get to work with, and in various different settings and formats. I thought, having a cup of coffee is something that's that doesn't have a strict formal format, that allows us just to connect again, because I was thinking about this idea of the future is human to human, and you could connect with anyone. You could connect with a local citizen over a cup of coffee, but you could also connect with a minister of justice over coffee, for example, and sort of having that, taking away all the fancy terminology or whatever position someone's in, just sitting together and having a talk about what it is that we want to change, where it is that we want to go. And that's something we've been trying to do within our organization as well. We have sort of seasonal coffee meetings where we can meet online and just have a coffee together and just share sort of what's going on. And so I thought that's something that I always want to take with me and remember, is whoever I interact with and the work that I'm doing is just to meet that person where they're at and have them meet me where I'm at. And from there, see how we can together potentially create some change together.
I love that, definitely.
Yeah.
I love that. I think that thing about, that sort of, whether it's shared drink or shared food or something, there's something about that kind of space of breaking bread, of having that sort of time together, that's, like you said, that's not so formal, that you can get to know each other on that more human level.
Yeah. And
is
even
there
we've done that when we visited detention facilities. I think the stark difference in visiting a large scale prison, which really has that institutional character, and then going into a small scale facility where you just walk in, they're like, hey, sit down, do you want to have a cup of coffee? And someone's making coffee for you, one of the residents, and you all sit together at the table. That's a very different experience from a traditional prison visit. So even there, I've had that as well. And you might think that's unthinkable, but it exists and it's the reality. And I think that's really cool as well.
Absolutely, I love that. And just drawing on your experience a bit more, how, you've talked about some of these sort of key things, but how do we start to promote humanness more within our our justice systems, and how do we enable people to be seen as human, and to sort of feel human within our justice systems?
I think it is a complex question, because there's so many elements of our justice system where humanness is either already prominent or not prominent enough. I think a part of that would be really ensuring that whatever we, for example, do, but also others in the work, is always trying to strive towards a multi-stakeholder approach. I think that's very important in whatever you do, thinking, okay, who are we involving? Why are we involving them? Are we missing anyone? Because I think the first step to introducing humanness is creating a space or allowing the opportunity for people to share their sentiment or perspective and their voice. And as soon as you don't do that, you're already missing part of that opportunity. And I think that's part of as we all sort of have a role to play as well in how the justice system operates, and even in crime and criminality. It's it's how we as a society perceive what is illegal, what is quote unquote criminal. Why do people even get involved with the justice system in the first place? Every person, even if they feel like they haven't been directly been involved, sort of has a play in that. And so I think that's the first step is allowing access to the work that we're doing and trying to involve as many people as possible. I think that would be a first step. And then also thinking about at what levels. Obviously, there's different levels where people meet and where they collaborate and work together. That there is a fairness in how we take what everyone is contributing. So I think here, a lot of we connect a lot, which makes us human, of course, but what we also need to do is take that steps further and actually create change. So actually move things, take action. I think that oftentimes, or it's happened to me before, that I've come home and I felt really inspired and connected and I heard all these great things, and then everybody goes back to their place and nothing really changes, nothing really happens. And I think to really allow human flourishing or for in order for us to thrive, we owe it to ourselves to not stop there and to really be adamant and say, okay, what are the next steps that we can take and keep pushing for that? So so that we also especially the people who are most often targeted through our justice system feel that there is something changing and it's not just a lot of conversation and words. I think we really need to make sure that we do see changes in practice. So I think that would also be sort of, we owe that to each other as humans to ensure that we follow through in a certain way. Those are a couple of things I'm thinking of right off the bat.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have an example of where Rescaled has done that sort of work in terms of taking things to the next step and sort of implemented or sort of got some changes that have resulted in some action or something sort of different
Yeah,
having
I think
done sort of
there's
work on that
various
European
levels.
level?
I think at a European level, one of those would be that we had council conclusions on small scale detention. So what that means essentially is it's a policy recommendation which was adopted in June of 2024, which was essentially all ministers of justice of the 27 EU member states adopting a recommendation which that said we want to look more into small scale detention and its potential and its benefit for integration and rehabilitation after release and so forth. So that was the official sort of framing of that recommendation, and really looked into inviting the actual European countries, so the member states, as well as the European Commission. So from that level to see, what kind of expert groups could we organize, what kind of funding streams, what we need in order to do that, what type of training, we should share data, we should share statistics on what already exists, so what we already know about this. That was a really big commitment that we were sort of hoping to bring forward, but of course we didn't really know if that was going to work. And I think that was a really big step and also quite courageous of the political actors at that level to say, okay, we want to put our foot forward for this. Let's see what we can do with that. I think that's one of them. Other examples, I think, at a national level, which has been really great to see, is that I think I've mentioned before that some of these facilities have already been existing, some for 10, 20 years. So it's actually not a new idea what sort of how Reskilled came to exist or what it came to exist around, but there's also been new implementations of detention facilities due to the ongoing work of some of our members and just tirelessly advocating and connecting all these people and going around, for example, municipalities and speaking with the mayors and saying, would you ever be interested and what could that look like? And working together with local organizations and actually seeing them do that work, to then actually opening and implementing a detention or a transition house at the local level and seeing that successfully operate, I think has been really strong. And if you look at how the prison system largely has stayed the same over centuries, and then being able to bring about that change in a decade, I think is really incredible work, and it's something we are working on continuously. And another thing I think we're doing is in the in-between steps, because obviously sometimes that can take time, and definitely systemic change, obviously that's decades away if we're being realistic about it, is also that taking the next step also means avoiding falling back into the conversation of what doesn't work. I think that's something that's quite recurrent, and we're trying to move forward and say, okay, what does work? What can we do? Taking that next step And same, for example, for when it comes to academic research, encouraging, we need more on what works. We already know what doesn't work, or that it's not working the way we're currently doing it. So sort of really trying to encourage people of, okay, we know that doesn't work. So what have you tried, or what have you experienced? And what were the pitfalls of that? And what were your lessons learned? And if you share that with each other, is there a new idea coming out of that? Really always keeping that at the forefront of our activities, I think, is also an example of how we're trying to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that resonates with what we're trying to do with this sort of future of this human series. Is almost like an appreciative inquiry, kind of where is the positive, examples, where are these pockets of the future already happening? And I think it was a really important point that you made around actually what you can achieve in a decade. Really, it's it seems a relatively short amount of time, but huge shifts really can happen with that time in terms of narratives, in terms of like physical buildings that you're talking about, in terms of policy shifts, to get that within 10 years is there. But like you said, we have to be careful not to let that slip back. It's that ongoing
exactly
to keep that going. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's great to hear about that sort of European level, and then that kind of national level, and even that kind of local municipality level within those countries. So all those different layers that you're working within and your members are working within. And I just wondered if if we gave you a magic wand and, we had a transformed human justice system, coming back to that, what we were talking about earlier about the senses, and you've been in, small scale detention, you started telling us a bit about how it looks and feels and sounds different to our current system. Can you expand on that a bit more and paint the picture of what that more human justice system might look like?
Yeah, I think as a first step, what that would look like is also reduced populations in our justice system, so incarcerating less people. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think we have witnessed, and we also know that that's a core part in implementing what we want to do and ensuring that we can execute deprivation of liberty in a different way, because there's just so much pressure currently. So diverting away from justice, I think if you really look at the root causes of how people get involved in the first place, a lot of them exist outside of justice. And so I think diverting away from the justice system is something that I'd want to see in the future, that we're doing that, we've done that, and we're doing that. And then if it's really necessary, whoever is still funneled into the justice system and where someone is sentenced to deprivation of liberty, which essentially means a restriction of their freedom and how their time is spent, but not so much other parts of their being and of their rights as well. I think what that would look like, and I'm basing that off of, I think, a shared vision, but also what I've already seen in practice, is that people are encouraged and asked to take responsibility. So people who have maybe been the cause of harm are taking responsibility, but they're doing that in communication with others who have been involved in that act of harm. So they're able to repair it collectively with anyone who's directly been affected by that harm, but even potentially just the community. I think when something happens, it also ripples through a community. There's certain feelings, there's emotions, and sort of allowing there to be a relationship. I think that now when I think of the justice system, I feel that I think of isolation and closed off, and oftentimes either a negative relationship or a lack thereof. And I'd love to see a relationship, whatever that might look like. It might start out negative, or it might have tensions, and it might, go back and forth depending on, I think that's human as well, and that's natural, and sort of working towards what can we do. And I think showing that responsibility and allowing people to see what their needs are personally, to see that they can thrive, after release. And ideally, of course, it would be great if people don't, end up in the same system again. But really working on the long term, I think the justice system can do much better in working in the long term. So I think that's something that really connecting it with the broader ecosystem. And what I mean when I say ecosystem is connecting it to housing, connecting it to secure employment and all these aspects that are really important for even people coming in, but also coming out of the justice system. So I think for me in the future, what that would look like is the justice system is collaborating way more with all these other sectors in that ecosystem, and sort of that we've broken down some of the silos. Because I think that's where the magic happens. That's where we're able to do the long term, because the justice system cannot do it on its own. It doesn't make sense. And now it's sort of left to fend for itself and ensure that, that magically happens within the institution that we currently have. So I think really that breaking down collaboration and saying, okay, crime or even acts of harm and repairing harm is a part of our systems, our multiple different social systems, and seeing where do they connect and how can they reinforce each other and sort of share a bit of that burden. I think that's what I would want to see in the future if I'm looking at the justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a bit more as well, for someone who hasn't sort of visited a small scale detention center, what that, building and what's happening in the people in it, sort of what's going on, just to give people paint a picture and give people a sense of what that's like.
They will differ a little bit based on the country that they're located in and also who they're catering towards. So as I said, we propose that it's a maximum of 30 people, to allow that. If we look at also examples of collective housing and, how many in-depth relationships can you have with a person, you yourself as well? How many relationships and friendships do you have? How many connections are you able to maintain? Sort of looking into that maximum. But in practice, they differ. So we've seen facilities that go from 10 people to 40 to 50 to 60, which can still be inspirational in terms of how they're working. So the idea is really that most of the time there will be less static security, which means there's less alarm systems, there's less cameras, there's less or no walls even. So oftentimes the building will look a bit more residential. So as you would imagine a house, that's why we use the term detention house, because it sort of gives you an image of what that could look like. Of course, that differs a bit, but we have examples of former student housing or elderly care homes that have been revamped into that. There's also there are some examples of farms sort of being transformed into a detention facility as well. So they can differ in terms of what the building is, but what the underlying idea is that staff is way more connected, really knowing people and being able to support them. So oftentimes now, I think 80% of what staff do is according to the building and sort of, the operational staff, and 20% goes into the social aspect of the work. And it's the idea that it's the other way around. So really sitting down with people and being able to support them in terms of the education that they might be going through in that moment, or getting employment and getting tips on employment. And the idea is also that as they're community integrated, that we don't replicate everything inside, so it's not fully closed off, but people could be and can go into the community to meet their service provider, for example, their healthcare provider, whether that's their local doctor, or their general practitioner or a psychologist. And that it's important for that feeling of what's normal, let's say, but it's also important for continuity, because oftentimes, obviously, being incarcerated is really hard, but the break of being released is the hardest, because you've had support and then that falls away again and you have to rebuild everything. So essentially what we want to see is a certain level of continuity and potentially being able to see the same service providers again. And then also for their families and social networks. Oftentimes, at least from the facilities that we've mapped and that we visited and that I've also been to, they're nicer environments to be in as a visitor coming in and not having to go through all these checks and potentially, having to put all your stuff in storage. I mean, it still depends on what the specific security level will be in that point. But that's also really important as well in providing more a dignified contact between an incarcerated person who is a resident of the house and their social network. And then a lot of them will also work on specific projects in providing value and providing something for the neighborhood. That has been, for example, taking care of a local garden of a residential care home, for example, cleaning up the streets, for example, walking dogs of people who might be in vulnerable positions in the community and are not able to do that. There's also some examples of, for example, farms So as I mentioned, there's a couple of farms. So whether that's a traditional farm or there's also these ideas of vertical farming that in less space, they've been able to grow crops and stuff. And so the people who are incarcerated, for example, if they're working after work, they will take care of this farming. And there's been examples where they've donated that together with the Red Cross, for example, to local families in the area who might be in need of additional support in these. So there's like a lot of ideas on how that comes in. And on the other hand, we've also seen, for example, in Belgium, the very first detention house that opened in 2022, they also live in like separate, smaller living groups, and they have sort of detention counselors and coaches who work with them as well. And they do sort of activities where they also invite the local community to come in for they bake cakes and make coffee and have a talk with them, and people come there as well. So in the other way, people are also giving back through these volunteering programs. So I think that's what some of them can look like. And then depending on who they're targeted towards, whether that might be women or women with kids or younger people, especially 18 to 25-year-olds, that might be very different also in terms of some of them have a very strict program. There's a lot of rules, there's a lot of activities, there's a lot of structure and schedule, because sometimes that's also really what the people need. But the idea is that because it's at a smaller scale, the staff is also able to adapt that and see, okay, for this person, I think we might need to change that, or we might need a different methodology. We now have a new composition of people in the detention facility, and having a bit more flexibility to adapt that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about the community integration. It reminds me of Hope Street, an example that we have here in the UK for women, and the cafe area that they've got where people can come in, from the community and be served and have the cafe. But they've also got co-working spaces as well, where probation officers can come in and share a space with charity workers and with others. It's sort of, like you said, it comes back to the sort of breaking down of silos and making this, bit more porous, sort of in and out, through that. So it reminds me of that example, which is I think
Hope Street is a really great one. And for example, I've also been to one which is a Norwegian example, which oftentimes people think that all of or most of the good examples are actually in Scandinavia, which is not truthful. But in this case, there's one of them which is a really good example as well. It's called Lera. In the Trondheim region, and they actually have a gardening center on the premises. So there's people from outside who work in the gardening center together with some of the men who are incarcerated there, and people just come and go. So it's like you go to a normal gardening center, you buy your plants and this and that. So you can't really tell from the outside because there's no wall or there's no fence. You can't really tell that it is a prison. And so that's a really cool example as well of how they've been able to do that. And they actually put up a small sign, quite a small sign, where it says, oh, this is a detention facility, this is an official prison, but it's still a quite small sign. And we knew it wasn't there previously. So we had asked them, why did you put up that sign? Was there a reason? And they said, we actually had local kids coming over because there is a playground on the premises as well for when kids visit, for example, and the kids would walk over and run and be on the playground. And there was like, so we were asked to at least signify that it is a prison because it was so normalized and like blending into the neighborhood, that they actually did that just to sort of, come forward and compromise with everyone. But that's the energy, and that's what it sort of looks like to the local community. And I think it's quite a funny example as well of how successfully it can really integrate with the community in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think? You've talked a lot about, obviously Rescale have taken lots of the steps. You've talked about the reconstructing, deconstructing and reconstructing. You've talked about, those changes on the kind of European level. What's next? What are some of the next steps that you think, we need to continue to sort of build this movement, to continue to share this practice both within Europe and potentially, sort of more globally as well?
Yeah, I think practically really focusing on implementation looks like looking into the legal frameworks and seeing, under what circumstances can someone be placed in such a facility? How is such a facility viewed legally? Is it like a prison? What does that look like? Can someone arrive there from court directly, or do they transfer from another prison? And is that something that's handled by the prison administration? So really looking into the practical things and what are selection criteria for being transferred to such a facility, and who decides what those criteria are, or who has the final word, what does that look like? And then also looking into the financial aspect. So what does it look like cost-wise in a specific country in terms of initial investment, staff operating costs? These are obviously questions that we will get from policymakers as well. So looking into the specifics of that. And then also what we're working on a lot is providing more tools and communication guides on how to communicate with the local community. How do you prepare them for such a facility being in the community? In what way do you involve them? In what way can you sort of, if you think of democratic participation, what role can they play? Really, I think these are some of the core components, and what type of buildings, if we can look for existing buildings that might be empty at the moment in the community, can we transform those? Or if it's a new build, what does that look like from an architectural perspective? You need a lot more common spaces. So what does that look like exactly? And in terms of the rooms, how do you manage sort of safety and privacy? Because some of them will have a few stricter security measures, and how do you do that while still blending in with the neighborhood? So these are really concrete things that we're working on now, and co-producing a lot of knowledge on this to be able to give that to local stakeholders and help facilitate a better implementation of these facilities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk a little bit about that co-production process? And you mentioned earlier, the importance of, people with lived experience of justice systems being involved. How does Rescaled, incorporate their views in the co-production, and how do you take that move forward to that co-production process?
Great question. So I think there's a couple of different ways. Of course, our members are doing a lot of work at the local level and have quite extensive networks, and maybe have been active for 20 years already in justice reform. So they have quite broad ideas. So we have some member organizations which are also led by experts with lived experience, for example, or some of them will, for example, our Czech member, I think about a third of their staff have lived experience, for example, and they're sort of involved in various different activities of the NGO, but also in some of our Rescaled activities. And so it's very important in whatever we do that we involve people lived experience. And we've worked a lot on work defining that as well. So we've worked together. We worked on we did that in a couple of projects, and we also recently worked on a position paper together with our organization, the Movement, quite a few experienced experts as well. And what do we mean when we say people with lived experience? And we've chosen to use that as a broader umbrella term so that we're able to include more people with different types of experience. So that could be lived prison experience, that could also be experience as a victim or survivor, also as children of incarcerated people, for example, or sort of as their social network, and then also having some work experience, for example. So and then we're able to define that more specifically depending on the activity that we're doing. But what's also been important to us is, again, putting that into a multi-stakeholder approach. So not over asking or like expectations, and making sure that we can provide a fair and safe environment as well in how we do that. And at the core of that is always giving people, not even giving, because you're not able to give that, people have the agency and the autonomy to decide how and if their lived experience plays a role, whether that's even disclosed. And I think part of our work has been trying to find a balance between making it more visible and being more explicit in how we're working on it, and at the same time not forcing anyone to disclose it or to make it this thing where you just check a box. So sometimes being asked like how many people with lived experience were involved in the activity, and then something that you don't want to start counting people. It's like, oh, you belong under this label and you belong under this label. So I think that was a big outcome of this position paper as well. And also seeing that there's a difference between just a person who has lived experience and a person who is also just an expert working on justice reform, and who may have lived experience. And our preference, at least in the current shape or form, and especially at the European level, goes towards working with these experts who have experience, because at the level that we're working at, that is what works best in the environment that we're able to provide as well. I think if members work at a local level, you get to see people every day, you get to interact as well. But since we work a lot internationally online, sometimes you don't have the opportunity, and we want to make sure that we know people well enough to see what are their needs, how do they want to contribute, what can we give them, what do we need to be mindful of. So we do make that distinction as well. And that's specifically due to the content of our work, because we're active in justice reform. So we also look for people who are wanting to do that as well. And I think so that's how they fit into that. As well, and that includes co-production. So if we work on, we have launched a knowledge workspace on women, for example, we're going to be launching more knowledge workspaces where the idea is that we co-produce knowledge on the topic of, for example, women in detention houses, or for example, architectural design in detention houses. And so the idea is that we can produce new knowledge and that we bring people together to sit and talk about that and go really in depth. And what does that mean? And we also do that through projects. And so we always will utilize this multi-stakeholder approach, and people's lived experience are a part of that. But it will always depend in what, how that takes shape and who the people are who are even, involved, and let that sort of dictate as well as what that collaboration looks like. Exactly.
Yeah, excellent. And we can share some links to some of that work that you've talked about in the position paper. That sounds really interesting. And I think lots of people are having these conversations, and they're really important. And just the idea that you're giving space to these and trying to navigate what are really sort of complex issues and definitions, and
being transparent about, what that looks like, I think is the most important part as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you work across, different countries around Europe. What do you think are the main benefits of having this as a sort of a global European-wide network, and what other connections do you have outside of Europe as well?
I think there's huge benefits. I think that I've noticed that throughout the years of working with Rescaled, is that we learn so much from different contexts, and whether that's a cultural difference, whether that's a historical difference, also when it comes to political climates and current, like historical climates and current political climates, as well as legal frameworks, they differ so much. I think it's a really added value because we're able to learn from other countries and how they did that, and then seeing, what parts of that can we translate to our context. And I think that's just an added benefit all around, because it also allows you to think outside of the box. Because if you're used to a certain way of working within your country, that's how things are done, and that's what the process looks like, it can be hard to think outside of the box and think, how can we do that differently? But having another example that works completely differently is like, oh, that's super interesting. And then you might see avenues and loopholes or elements where you think, actually, that is possible within our system. So I think that's a really powerful thing. And another thing is, and that's part benefit, part challenge, I think, exactly because of that. Sometimes, it makes conversations more complex. It makes collaboration more complex. It also increases the risk in terms of, sharing good practices and examples. We want to avoid something being just exported and imported into another country the same way, because that's not how it works. It needs to be based on the culture. It needs to be based on the actual local solution and the people. So also being mindful of how we share good practices to avoid that from happening. So I think that's part of the challenge, but it's a good thing because it makes you reflect way more on the work that you're doing, and even seeing as, okay, this term is never going to work for us. Even the term detention house, if we translate that to our language, if we do a literal translation, it means something completely different in our context. So we're actually going to have to find a new term for that. And what would that term be? And so these are super interesting discussions and learnings that we take from that. So I think it's a huge benefit. And at the same time, I hope that we're able to maintain a good level of collaboration, because with many countries, it's not that easy. From my perspective and my team as well, coordinating that and facilitating that, seeing of how you balance that, of course, is also tricky. But yeah, we mostly focus that in Europe, so 20 European countries where we have the members. And then we do have connections outside of Europe as well. And so that's mostly based on learning and the educational perspective and narrative building, because we, that's as far as our capacity and sort of our vision reaches right now. It's a European movement, but we do absolutely love working internationally as well. There's so many great examples internationally of these types of facilities as well, of the more collective, going back to the community. So we've worked with some stakeholders in the US, the Philippines, Brazil, different places where we're just really, really eager to learn from them, potentially have them learn from us. And I think that's something that we're going to continue doing, because even if the contexts are even more different than between European countries, there's still so much learning to be done around common values and principles.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, what keeps you going when things get tough? This is, like what you're trying to deal with complex questions, complex issues, multiple countries, multiple
Yeah.
stakeholders at different layers and levels. How do you look after yourself and others that are involved in the movement?
Yeah.
Remembering that we are all only human after all.
Yeah. It's tricky sometimes. Sometimes it feels like the work that you're doing, there are small steps, or I mentioned that invisible part, and it might seem like nothing is changing. So I think part of what I do for myself and what I do with part of my team is celebrating achievements and successes and
Yeah.
taking an actual moment for reflection. Let's look back over this last 6 months. What happened? Why did that happen? I think that is really, really helpful to see how far you've come, and that even if your vision and your goal is still far away, that you've been able to create some change. I think that's really important. And also, I think part of that, or what keeps me going as well, is sometimes just having a simple, that goes back to the coffee, having a simple conversation, because oftentimes you're in projects and you have deadlines and you're working on this and you're within a certain process, and everything sometimes can feel very technical, and just meeting with someone and having a really good conversation is something that can really keep me going, that can change my day. And then I remember that that's what it's really all about, and that movement, that's what it's based on. And I think even if the circumstances change or developments change or a political climate changes, the people are still there, who make up part of the movement, who believe in it. And I think part of that is reminding yourself that that won't just die off, no matter if other parts and other circumstances change. So I think that's something that I use as well to remind myself of believing in that power of that vision as well.
Of that, yeah, the power of the vision, the thing that keeps everyone going
Yeah,
towards that same goal, that same sort of
yeah.
outcome. I love that. And what things have you read or listened to or watched that inspire you, that you might be able to recommend to anyone listening to this who's interested in a more human justice system, is interested in Rescaled? What would you recommend that they go and take a look at?
Mm-hmm. Um, I was stuck on this question for a bit, because it draws a bit back to how I am as a human, as a person. So I'm very bad with picking like favorites or examples in that sense. But I was thinking of a recommendation of what I can give, especially also linked to, what if when it all gets too much, is I really do also recommend fiction. So what I mean by that is reading books or watching movies that are fiction based and not nonfiction, not all documentary. Because I think a lot of us in our work, we're already in the day to day, we're constantly confronted with our current reality, and this is what's happening. This is
Yeah.
what we want to do. And so I think that's partly, it's a really good outlet sometimes
Mm, yeah.
to re-energize for the work that you're doing. And at the same time, what I've noticed as well is in a lot of movies and books that I read now, even if it's a fictional story, it's really nice because you're able to analyze how we work as societies and humans, and it's sort of a depiction sometimes of where we might want to go. And it's easier to sometimes to take, or it's a nice break to take a fictional piece, or a fictional story, but then analyze what that means. What are sort of some values that are in there? What does that tell us about how we deal with conflict? Um, and and I think that that is something that informs my work really well, because it allows me to take a step back and reflect on it without getting frustrated, because things that might not be working well. And so I just thought, that's my general recommendation. But I thought one book that I'm reading now, which I haven't finished it yet, it's called Before the Coffee Gets Cold. You see,
Very
there's a
appropriate.
recurring theme. It's originally a Japanese book, so I'm reading that English translation. It's a fictional story as well, and basically it takes part in this old cafe in a back alley in Tokyo. And the fictional idea or behind it is that apparently there's this idea that you're able to time travel in that cafe. And so you follow these different people who are trying to figure out whether that's true or not. And there's lots of rules that you have to follow if you want to try it. And one of them is you have to return before the cup of coffee gets cold. You don't have that much time. And it follows the stories of these people who want to go back to tell someone something or to ask someone something. And that book was, really reminding me of, when it comes down to it, what do I want to tell another person? What do we really need to share? What's really important? And I think that's a good lesson for the work that we're doing with the time that we have with someone, or within a project, to be open and honest and candid about, where we are now, what's not going well, what our experiences are, and where we want to go. And I think for me, that book, it's been really nice to just, throughout the personal stories, to just think about, what would that look like for me, or what would that look like for some of the people that I'm working with now. So I think my recommendation is look into some other stories which might seem very far away from the work that you're doing, but essentially you'll find lots of ways back to justice reform, essentially, as well.
I love that. And I love the time traveling, that, it links very well with this idea of the future is human, and
Exactly.
and that piece about imagination as well, actually. And I think, yeah, like you said, that sort of reading of fiction, sometimes we can struggle to imagine and to think different, what something might look like different in decades to come. But yeah, sort of having that, reading that fiction and thinking about the future in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll definitely have to get that book. That sounds fantastic. I love that.
It's a good one to check out, and it's not so thick as well. So if you have limited time, it's a good one as well.
It's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for our conversation, Noah. Like, that's been so rich, and yeah, it's just covered so many bases, both in terms of working at that individual level, that local level, right up to the sort of European level. Yeah, and you've done a really good job at sort of painting that picture of this real pocket of the future, something that is happening in multiple countries, that looks different, that sounds different, that's based on different structures, where those norms have been deconstructed and reconstructed, and the work that you're doing to share that learning, and to take that forward, is really, really inspiring. And I know that our listeners will be really interested. So I can't wait to hear you on the panel with our other
I'm very
speakers
excited.
from across the US and Brazil and the UK as well, to share your thoughts and ideas and take this further. And like you said, this is all about not just sort of talking, but sort of taking action afterwards as well. And I hope that people will be really inspired, and you may get some new members or people that are interested that haven't heard about this before. So we really appreciate your time.
Really cool. Thank you for the opportunity to do this interview as well. And I do really look forward to the session, and also listening into the other conversations that you've had, and learning more about them as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Noah.
Thanks.